Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
So back in that time period, you had some training. Obviously, you've been a game officer in the north part of the country, in northern Rhodesia. You had this training in the field, and you ended up training. Like your scientific doctrine, you always were trying to find solutions to problems that people didn't even realize it seemed like they had the problem. And so you changed. You actually started training SAS and police officers, mixed race groups of men. What were you doing? Why did you do it?
Well, it was, as you say, a very mixed thing. I had started as a young ecologist looking at the wildlife and the wildlife habitat deterioration, which means it's also habitat deterioration for humans. And that's what I'd started to study and still am on. And then, because of this chaotic situation we were in, I was also conscripted into the army and became an officer in the Rhodesian army. But at the same time, well, not at the same time, but during these muddled years, I went into Parliament to fight what was happening, which was that the handling politically of the situation and militarily. So the training you talk about was, yes, I describe all that in the memoir. I, at one stage, was training mostly blacks, but coming from police, special branch, etc., and from the SAS. And I was training these as mixed-race groups to essentially enable the army to contain the situation, because the sort of civil war we were in, there can be no military victory. It can only be resolved politically. And so therefore, in my mind, the role of the army was to maintain virtually a neutrality in that, and to honor the Constitution and what the dream was for the country. But we had most officers in the army that believed like that had been fired, the senior officers, the generals, etc., and most officers in the army had disavowed our oath of allegiance to our Constitution and had shifted their allegiance to a white racist party. Now, I knew that that could only lead to disaster, so I was trying to get our army to understand, no, we must be more neutral, and buy time for the politicians to resolve this amongst themselves. But the more successful we were in the army, the more arrogant Ian Smith became, bragging and boasting that he was winning a war. No, he couldn't win the war. It's not a winnable war that way. And he was refusing to negotiate. In fact, he said he would never, ever negotiate, and derided me in public for, my crazy idea of even talking to your opponents. He swore blind he never would. Well, of course, he ended up being forced to do so. But by the time he forced to do so, at the Lancaster House conference, he was no longer Prime Minister. He had already conceded power to Muzorewa, a black, and who was now Prime Minister when we went to a conference. And Smith was a minister without portfolio at it. It was really, in many ways, a ridiculous situation.
So, but you did this bushcraft training for these officers and these police officers. And, you go in great length in your book about what it was like to train them and the conditions and stuff like that. And then after a while, it sounded like you ran afoul of the leadership, the generals, and they moved you off into another spot. But those guys that you trained became what is known as the Salute Scouts. Could you explain to me? Because a lot of times I hear people try to tie you to the Salute Scouts. And of course, the Salute Scouts were special operations that did some terrible things during the war. And some of that sometimes rubs off on you. So explain to me, how did that come to be? How did the Salute Scouts come to be? Where did they get their training from? And why, or were you part of that?
Yes, I was part of that. But the winners write the history. So if you search or Google Salute Scouts, you'll see how it arose from General Walls and Ron Reed Daly, Colonel. Well, it didn't, but the winners write the history. And so in the book I describe the origin of it, and it began at one point when the Army gave me approval and the police, and what we did was highly secret. Only General Rawlins and the head of police intelligence knew what we were doing, and I was training these mixed groups to try to effectively neutralize the actions of guerrilla army penetrations into the country as friends of the people, etc. Now, the army and the police, the cooperation didn't last, and so in talks that I was not privy to, the head of the army and the head of the police decided to split, and so GATU, guerrilla anti-terrorist units, were abandoned. Now, at that point, the police went on to form PARTU, police anti-terrorist units, which essentially were just police reservists in Land Rovers running around the country, and some very good people and doing their best. And the army went on to the Salute Scouts. And the School of Infantry, a tracking wing of the School of Infantry. But at that point, I did get the approval of the Army to recruit territorial soldiers, like I was, people from the game department, the ranches, etc. And so then we formed the Tracker Combat Unit, and within a year we were having successful operations, trying to buy time for the politicians to negotiate. But yes, I fell out with the General Peter Walls, who was by then commanding the army. I had worked with previous commanders of the army, and that you see a picture of me in the book, meeting with the Minister of Defense and Keith Coster, who was then commanding the army, and myself. You see the three of us on a forward airfield talking. But by the time General Walls headed the army, I had reached the point where I realized I just had to oppose what the Prime Minister was doing and what his top general was doing. So I believed it only ethical to go to my commanding officer, General Walls, and to inform him that I would be publicly criticizing him. And I couldn't see that I could command men under him while I'm criticizing him, so I asked to be relieved of my command. So then I became a nobody, a non-entity in the army, and I did proceed from then on to criticize his handling of the war and the Prime Minister's handling of the war, because it was obviously going to be a self-inflicted defeat.
So tracking, though, what you learned when you were in that time period, you write about the fact that you had another aha moment in your ecological mindset over land, because tracking in certain conditions was different than other conditions. And you mentioned that a couple of times in your book. Explain to me how that worked, and then the last question I have in that line is, explain to us what a bush prawn is.
What's
a bush prawn?
Let me start with a bush prawn. A bush prawn was just the name we gave a scorpion, because it looks a little bit like a prawn, and when you had to eat them, it was better to call them a bush prawn than a scorpion.
So how did you eat them?
So that was just humorous. But with regard to the question you're asking, how did it connect the tracking I was doing in the army and beginning to resolve one of the most critical problems facing humanity, really, the habitat deterioration I was seeing. And I mentioned how a person called Liebenberg wrote a book tracking the origin of science, and I believe his theory is correct. Now, tracking involves an incredible amount of observation at a level most people never do, but trackers have to, and they've done for thousands of years. And if their observation, their deduction, their reasoning was wrong, they died, or their families died. And in the war, it was much the same. If you're tracking your observation, deduction, logic as you're seeing clues, if you're wrong, you're dead. You walk into an ambush or whatever. So it's a very acute level of observation, foreign to most of us. Now, doing that and spending 20 years of tracking animals and people, unfortunately, what I realized during the war was I had long periods where we were tracking all day, 2 or 3 days. We would be tracking a guerrilla group through this sort of bush. In fact, we fought all around here. And so you have sleepless nights. You can't light a fire because you don't know how close the enemy are, etc. And so you just sleep, and it may be raining and muddy, and you just try and cover your rifle up and sleep on the muddy ground, waiting for dawn, so you don't sleep very well. So in those long nights, the scientist in me would be kicking in and asking questions, because I began to observe that the tracking on one day might be very easy, and on another day it might be very difficult. But we're tracking in the same soils, the same rainfall, everything is the same. Well, why is it difficult one day and difficult and easy another day? As a scientist, we're trying to work that out. And what I realized, it had nothing to do with the soils or the vegetation we were tracking over, because they were essentially the same, but it had everything to do with the purpose for which the land was being used, managed. So if we were tracking people and they happened to go through a vast national park, the tracking conditions would be relatively easy. If we were tracking people through a communal land with agro-pastoralists and totally different management on the land, it could be extremely difficult. And then you begin to look at, all right, so it's how the land is being used or managed that is making this vast difference because of what it's doing to the vegetation and the soil, because that's where you're picking up your signs. You're picking up your signs of where people are and why they're moving from either spoor, footprints, signs on the soil, or you're picking it up from signs above the soil in the vegetation. And that means the dew knocked off the grass, the color of the grass, the bend of the leaves, spiderwebs broken, whatever it is, or simply where they walked. If a human is on average between 5 and 6 feet high, if the tracks start going under narrow things where they got ducked down, that's telling you a lot about what they're doing. If the tracks are constantly in the open, that tells you something. When the tracks, if you're following tracks, actual tracks, if the human that you're tracking, or the animal, a cow grazing or a buffalo or whatever, puts its foot right on a coarse perennial plant, that's telling you something. You know something's wrong, because a human doesn't do that unless they're moving at night and unaware of where their feet are going. If they're moving in the day, they'll put their foot next to the plant. So if we see the foot going on the plant, that's telling us things. So these are the clues you're picking up, and so that it was a training that I, saw as unfortunate at the time because we're killing each other. But it was a training as a scientist that I don't know any other scientist in the world has had. 20 years of that.
Yeah. So that's stepped away from your military service and got into politics. So explain what happened. How did you end up there, and why did you form your own party?
I had people appealing to me to go into politics, Pat Bashford, who led the Centre Party, and others, and I would have nothing to do with politics. I didn't believe in politicians. I believed they, were bad and wouldn't have anything to do with it. I talked about it with Pat Bashford, the leader of the main opposition to Smith on the white side, and he was a client of mine, tobacco farmer, who's running cattle as well, etc. And we would spend the day working and the evening talking politics and so on. And he appealed to me, but I wouldn't do it for the reasons I've said. And we did talk about the possibility of penetrating Smith's party, but it was too dangerous to do that. Anyway, I wouldn't. But there rose a time when I actually was shaving and looking at myself in the mirror, looking myself in the face and saying, Allan, what are you going to tell your two children, Meg and Jim? What are you going to tell them in the future when we've lost everything we believed in here? And they say, Dad, you were at the peak of your life when that was happening. What did you do? That question was profound to myself. And that very morning I went and joined Smith's party and went into politics, because I realized I had to try and fight it from within the political party in power.
So you were in Smith's party for a period of time.
Yes.
And then you formed your own party. Why?
I went into Smith's party to do a couple of things. One, learn how they made their decisions, how they governed, how they thought. I needed to know that, but also to work constructively with Smith, because there were many people in the country who said he wasn't the hothead. There were other hotheads in the party and racists, and he was just doing the best he could. So if I could work constructively with him, I intended to. What I learnt in my period in Parliament was how they thought. I could predict almost any move he was going to make, because I'd learnt how he did his thinking and planning, and they did. And what I also learnt was it was not possible to work constructively with him because he was the hothead. And so at that point I realized, okay, I can go no further here. And it was also being rumored that I would be likely to be the next cabinet appointment. And that was because of my successes in the military. And Smith was talking openly about them, and for the first time naming an officer in caucus, etc., myself. And that, to me, I didn't want to go that far. There's no way I wanted to be in his cabinet. And so I realized the time had come when I had to depart. And so at a caucus meeting, secret caucus meeting chaired by him, I asked if I could make a statement, and he agreed. And I announced, to his shock, that I was going to be resigning from the party and crossing the floor. There was no party to cross to because he dominated. But I was resigning from the party because I had no confidence in him to lead the country, which wasn't easy for him to hear in his own caucus. And I had no confidence in the generals handling the war. And so I would be publicly resigning but retaining my seat in Parliament. So that's how I came to do that. Now, when I went home after a very emotional day, I literally thought, what the hell do I do? I had no support, no money, no party to shift to, and I decided I needed to form a political party. And so I describe how I did that, and led an opposition to him that couldn't be branded racist, tribal, communist, capitalist, no ism. You couldn't brand us. He couldn't brand us. And that worked. He couldn't brand the party.
And I didn't understand this in the book or not, but did you actually get elected into the parliament as a member of your own party, or were you only in the parliament through Ian Smith's party?
When I got into Parliament, I got into the Smith's party against the opposition of the party. They didn't want me in Parliament. So a by-election came up, all right, in between elections where the Member of Parliament in one constituency resigned. So now the country had to elect a replacement. Now, automatically, that replacement would be a Smith supporter because he dominated everything, courts, army, press, everything. We didn't have a democracy anymore. So I knew that whoever the party nominated would be the candidate. And so the party nominated the chairman of the Matabeleland branch, that division of the country in which that constituency lay. So I went around and got friends to just sign enough signatures and nominated myself, even though I was in the party. So here was a new recruit to the party nominating himself, which was unheard of, against the opposition of his own party. And then we had to go to the committee that decided who their candidate would be, and I described what happened there. So we went to that, because of petrol rationing, we went in one car, met with the committee for that constituency of the party, and I let my opponent, who the party was supporting, the chairman, Strong, I let him go first to be interviewed by them. And I listened outside in the dark, and they asked him all the normal questions that people would ask of a politician. He gave all the normal assurances, etc. And then it was my turn, and I came in and they asked me the same questions, and I didn't give them those answers. I just told them I didn't like politicians. I thought politicians never carried through. They were effectively liars. And I said, all the questions they asked, I said, I can't promise you to do anything there. I know how powerless I'll be. I said, I'm only prepared to make one promise, and I will carry it out. And they said, what's that? I said, if you elect me, I will fight like hell for you. And I will not be a party hack. Well, I got in by 4 votes.
That's pretty good, though, considering you were a no one when you started there. So let's go forward. You started to do some business for your consulting on holistic management in the United States during the same time period. And while you were there, and of course you're a politician, you're an Army officer, you've been in war, and you get contacted by a fellow who wants to wine you and dine you, and then next thing you know, you find out it's the CIA.
In the height of this, I was in Salisbury, the capital, one afternoon when a couple, an elderly man and his wife, came to my home, and he was an American, they were Americans, and I sat them in my sitting room and talked to them, and he was asking for my advice to invest in business in the country. And I gave him my advice that would be extremely unwise, particularly as a foreigner, etc., etc. And that's it. He left, and my wife at the time, when they left, said, Allan, who were those people? And I said, well, he said he was so-and-so. He left me his card, which was nondescript, with an address in Texas, and I said, but he was either an idiot or he's CIA. There's no other alternatives. And so I kept his card. And when I was in America lecturing on my scientific work, I had his card, so I gave him a call. And he invited me to come and meet with him in Texas, which I did. And he wined and dined with me, and out came the answer. He was CIA, and he was trying to recruit me.
So what happened?
Well, I went along with that. I was taken to Langley, CIA headquarters. I underwent the normal lie detector test to see if I was a communist or had ever been a communist. That was the main thing they were seeking. And I passed that all right because I never have been. And I realized in talking to them, I was happy to be recruited, but on certain conditions. They wanted information, obviously, and I needed some things as well. So I agreed to provide them information on the political climate, what people were saying, what the political feelings. I said, I will never supply you with any military information because I am an army officer and those are my friends. And I never did. But I said, in return, I need some things because I'm having to operate outside the country to fight the Smith government, and I'm having to do all these things, send people to Washington as I did, go myself or go to London, etc. And I said, I need help because I operate a secret fund that known only to me, but I am the source of the money. It's what I earn outside the country. And I need to be able to bank, I need to be able to carry documents, etc. So they agreed to supply what I needed, and they did, and I continued to give them a political view.
So we're going to move into holistic management here. As you began developing your ideas about land management, you were working. You basically it's trial and error. What you were observing, and on the ground. Do you remember the first time someone from the scientific community told you that what you were stating as an observation was impossible? And what do you think? Why was there such a strong effort from governments and academic institutions to stop or discredit you and what you were teaching? I mean, what were they missing?
Well, I wish I'd known of its existence, but a fellow called Matt Kaplan has written a book, I Told You So. I would have cited that in my memoir because he describes it far better than I could across the medical field, paleontology, various branches of science. He explains that it's normal behavior, and I didn't understand it at the time. So in answer to your question, the moment in the 1960s when I realized I had made a scientific breakthrough that was vital for all humans and the future of civilization, effectively, on what was happening, why desertification was occurring and had already destroyed many civilizations. When I realized I had made that discovery after our beliefs of thousands of years, the first person I went to was our senior scientist, Dr. Oliver West, in this country in that field. And I knew Oliver because he was a friend of my father. He'd been a mentor to me as a young man. He was a wonderful guy. And I went and saw him in his home, and I said, Oliver, this is what I've discovered, but I don't have the resources. I'm one independent scientist with no funds, no resources, but I have discovered this, and I want you to take my work over, because I realized this had to go beyond me to open source, as it were. And I described the meeting and how he said he couldn't do that without first getting a budget to do experiments. And I said, you can't do experiments on what I'm talking about. You can only do comparisons, etc. But anyway, we discussed that, and I realized that this is going to take 3 or 4 years, and then they're going to try and do experiments which aren't going to prove or disprove anything, because you can't experiment about this. How do you... it's a fact that the Allies won the Second World War. Right? They did that through management and planning. How could you experiment on that? You can't. You can only record the results. So we had that discussion, and I had to go it on my own again and try to just do that. And I describe it in the book. Yeah. So from the very outset, and the same when I got to America, I tried to make my work be taken over by people who had the resources. But in each case, I failed, And that is normal academic scientific behavior. That would have happened to Copernicus, Galileo, Semmelweis, any number of people who made major discoveries that went against the prevailing view of society, institutions, and experts. There isn't a single case in history where it hasn't suffered the same fate as I did. People like that.
Great answer. So we're gonna go into a couple of hypothetical situations, and I want you to give me answers based on as a consultant. Okay. The first one is I'm a European. I have control over several concessions, hunting concessions, and forestry blocks in Zimbabwe. You're going to advise me on what I want to do in this landscape. What would be what would be the initial 5 things that you would instruct me to do?
I wouldn't instruct you to do anything. That wouldn't work. I would purely get you to try and find out what you're doing, how you want your life to be, etc. And you're leasing this land. But first I need to know what you're about, and I would get you to talk about that, and so on. Now, the fact that you're leasing this land and you're going to manage it in some way, but you can't manage land. It's not manageable. It is so tied to the culture of the people and the economy in which they operate that to try to manage the land, it doesn't work. That'd be me trying to manage your left arm and ignore the rest of your body. I can't do it. All right, so I would just enlighten them to that, and how we, through the work, my life's work, etc., and the thousands of people that worked with me, how we discovered a simple way to do that. So I'd purely give you information on how this can be done, and how, if you do it the conventional way, thinking that you can manage land, thinking that you can manage a hunting concession, I would just get you to realize that will have unintended consequences. Now, is that what you want? And just discuss it with you and provide you a simple way to get what you're really wanting.
So my thought is that I'm thinking big time. I want to be able to show the world that what we can do here can be used in other places, so that we leave the land and the planet better than we found it. I have this big plan, and I have lots of money. Money's not an issue. What would you advise? I mean, what can I expect by following your advice in 5, 10, 20 years from now? What would happen to the land that I am in charge of?
Well, if you're a man with unlimited money and you came to me to talk, again, I would say, what is it you're really wanting to achieve? And from what I'm hearing, all right, you are probably wanting to achieve high biodiversity, stable environments, prosperous people, clear running rivers. Again, this is the only way you're going to ever get out of the poor land, poor people, poverty, war syndrome. So if that's really your intention, then I would say, if you came in and managed, as we have, a piece of land with the economy, with the people, etc., that would be offensive, because it would contrast with land around you, and we've experienced that, right? So I would encourage you, talk to you, and say, all right, there are 2 levels of management. You could manage that situation you're talking about, but essentially you're talking about the human level of management. We manage our families, our institutions, and our communities, and then we can do nothing until we finance our families, our institutions, etc. And only when they're financed can we manage nature, as it were, to produce every single thing: abundant wildlife, food, beef, wheat, chai, cigars, art, literature, cell phones, everything that makes civilization possible. So you would be managing at that level. But global finance is driving environmental destruction. So at that level, you're limited to what you can achieve. And even if you got a wonderful success, it would be in a sinking ship. So I'd try to get you to understand that. And if I sit one-on-one with people, they usually get it pretty easily. And then I'd say, well, if your intention is for the good to spread over the whole country and truly save elephants and rhino and people and everything, then it cannot be done at the human level. It can only be done at the institutional level. The people who pass laws, regulations that dictate the management in the whole country.
And so who would that be in Zimbabwe?
Well, you attended a meeting with me yesterday. You saw a room full of, 60 people or more, very sincere, very dedicated, trying to plan for the sort of dream you expressed in this area, but you saw no representation at the human level, citizens. We need to be managing this in the interests of all citizens. So what you saw yesterday, and I tested it with a group, I said, hold up your hands, all of you who are paid to be here today by an institution, and every hand came up. Now, institutions are legal entities. They don't behave like a human. They're incapable of common sense, love, caring, any of these things. So here you have institutional management. So in what you're trying to achieve, and you've got unlimited money and influence, you could do an incredible amount of good by helping us to get that understood, that if we're going to solve these problems, it cannot be done at the human community level. It can only be done at the sovereign state level. And there it would be exactly the same. We would show governments that the way, not the lack of knowledge, not the lack of willpower, the way in which every single government develops policy that leads to law and regulations, that is what is causing the degradation, the violence, everything. So we would just simply show people how that is what is causing it, and that there is a simpler way to do it that brings people together, and policies are developed by any government in the interests of the citizens and not in the interests of institutions.
So if you were going to see a proper cross-section of the people, yesterday's meeting, what would you describe to me what it would have been made up of?
Well, at yesterday's meeting, you heard all the problems and concerns. Now, you heard many people bring up that one of the biggest problems is poaching. Now, you heard that yourself. Now, how many poachers were in the meeting? None. Now, if the poachers are a big problem, you've got to talk to them. Just like I said in this country to the Prime Minister, you've got to talk to your opponents. You've got to understand their point of view. If I was a male, black male in this community, under the 5 chiefs who you saw yesterday and met, who are trustees with me, if I was a black male, I would be a poacher. So you need to be asking me, why is that? It's because you're forcing me to be. You see, that wasn't even represented yesterday.
And who else was missing?
Every citizen was missing. You only had institutions represented. Now, you heard them yesterday paying great homage to the 5 chiefs that I work with as trustees, and you heard all the stuff we went through because they are the leaders, etc. Well, I quote in the memoir, during the war it was the same thing. The government said, as you heard yesterday, these are the leaders of the people. And I quote in the textbook Chief C.I.A, who was the paramount chief, talking to the people of this country and telling the people, we are your leaders. All right? And the government cut the sentence off there. So I provided the rest of his sentence. And the rest of his sentence, we are your leaders. We take our orders from government and we tell you what to do. That's not leading the people, that's leading the institution. Now, you look at today, it's actually worse, because when you had a white government, they were trying to divide and rule and all these, usual things, and they wanted the chiefs to have power, as they've just said. But since we've had a tribal government, their disempowering the chiefs has been even greater. So most of the chiefs now are given motor cars and all sorts of things. And whoever pays the wages commands what happens. So I didn't see citizens represented yesterday, and you cannot solve these problems without looking at the citizens' interests.
It's great. Awesome. Another situation. I'm a rancher in Montana. I've got about a 60,000 acre ranch, and I'm not in shortgrass prairie. I'm up in the mountains, so I get decent rainfall, but not a huge amount. I'm practicing some of your holistic management concepts. I'm running 1,000 head of cattle on 100 acres, putting electric poly wire around them for 24 hours, and I'm rotating throughout the year. I don't do it all year long, but I definitely do it all winter long. So I don't have to feed my cattle. So I don't have any year-round grazing. I mean, I have year-round grazing with no feeding. I've seen an increased soil moisture retention. I've seen healthier perennial grasses. I've got higher stocking rates and increased profitability, which is my bottom line for my family. And I'm seeing wildlife populations grow. However, the elk and other large ungulates are now becoming a problem on my irrigated hay, what I use to feed my yearlings. They're eating my second cutting, which is my most valuable hay cutting. What advice would you give to me?
I would suggest to you that you don't pick and choose what you are doing of my work. I don't know if this is a crude example or anything, but if we were talking pregnancy, can you be a little bit pregnant? No, you can't. All right? I'm talking about managing holistically, and what you're telling me is you're cherry picking out of that what you want to do. And I can tell you right now, and I can confirm you'll get the results you want. I can confirm that. But long term, you'll be doing damage. Why? Because you can't be an island unto yourself. We're all in this boat together. The people in Japan, in Somalia, we're all in this boat together. So if you promote that as a solution, look how wonderfully I've done in this particular environment, and this is the solution. If you did exactly the same things in Somalia, you'd be getting desertification. So indirectly, unintentionally, because we're all in the same boat together, you're doing harm.
But
You don't mean to.
Yeah, but I'm seeing great results. So who
Of course
am I
you are.
harming?
Sorry?
If I'm seeing these results and I'm seeing better economics for my family so I can stay on the land, who am I harming?
I'm telling you that if you start promoting that as the solution, it solved the problem for me, this is what you all need to do. Now you go out from that. It's like rewilding. That is a similar thing. Rewilding has risen in Britain, all right? And they will get good results because of the climate they're in, etc. But you are here and you're seeing rewilding in the national parks. That is rewilding. And our worst examples of biodiversity loss leading to desertification, leading to poverty, violence, floods, droughts, etc., is here in the national parks. So is rewilding the answer? No, it's an answer for places like UK. If you only look at that and not how they are financing it and what is happening to the country at large and how you're feeding people, you're only looking at one aspect of the problem. But if it was 100% successful there and it's doing such damage here, in terms of climate change, frankly, it doesn't matter if we wipe the whole of the UK off the map. It's only the size of an island off Africa, Madagascar, that is desertifying. So to promote that as a solution for the world, as is being done, good people accidentally, unintentionally, are helping to sink the ship.
But I think in this case, I don't think it's being promoted as a way to solve the Earth's problems or humanity's problems. But in the case of ranching in Montana, no shoe fits all feet, right? There's no one solution to everything. But if something's working, and I'm seeing positive results not only for my family economically, but also for the land and for the wildlife, why shouldn't we promote that to other similar scenarios with people that are like-minded?
It, I would just be repeating myself. You can do that in your climate. I gave a TED talk, went to 9 million people, in which I explained, for example, you talked about rotational grazing. I would advise you to never do rotational grazing, because in the long run, that will lead to loss of biodiversity. Now, in the short term, yes, you may be seeing some benefits. I describe in the memoir how the work John Acox was doing was wonderfully successful. But when I looked at it from an ecological point of view, I had severe doubts, but he gave me vital information that helped us to solve it. I didn't quote them, I don't think, in the memoir, but I did quote one. But we had two examples here. Now, in this country, we had a prestigious award, Natural Resources Trophy, big cup, awarded once a year to the rancher doing the most good, managing perfectly, the best management that could be. Now, one year, Jock Thompson won it, Colonel Thompson, on his ranch, and that was a very prestigious award. He turned to me and said, Allan, I've had the most prestigious award in the country for good management of the land. Will you give me an alternative opinion? Do I justify this? So I went to his managers, onto his Clonmore ranch. I spent a couple of days on it, and I provided documented evidence to him. I forget the exact percentage, but it was over 95% of the ground between the plants was bare and actively eroding. Now, with all the expertise, all that we had, and this was one of the most advanced countries in the world in conservation at the time, here was the most prestigious award given to land that was seriously deteriorating. How are you looking at the land? This matters greatly. In the memoir, I gave the example of the Sumas case, where the top expertise in southern Africa introduced a case which they called perfection of management in court. And court adjourned for me to see the same land. And I spent time documenting, taking pictures, recording, sampling. And when I had to go in the dock in court and was asked the same questions, it was similar. It was a near monoculture of one species of grass that requires desertifying conditions to thrive. So a lot depends on how you're interpreting these things, because ecologically, when we look at the land, and we should, you can see things quite differently. And I've tried to describe that in the book from the training. Now, the extent of misunderstanding of what I'm talking about, I think, could be well illustrated by a meeting. About 3 years ago in Washington, D.C., the Royal Society and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences held a meeting. They invited 50 people to that, all with very high qualifications, way beyond me, PhDs and so on, and they were invited because of their expertise in the field. And the subject of that conference was to establish the dollar value of biodiversity. Now, we live in a biosphere. Biosphere. You're breathing 21% oxygen. It's coming from biodiversity. So that is like inviting the 50 most brilliant fish in the ocean to a conference to discuss the monetary value of water. It doesn't even make scientific sense. The ecological illiteracy that we're living within is sad.
Okay. So if I have this big cattle ranch, should I just put all my cattle together and just keep moving them around the landscape all the time?
No. Just manage holistically. Start with you. You've got this ranch. What's your family? How do you want your life to be? Know how to do it. No reference to that land. How do you want your life to be? And when we establish that, how you want your life to be, then I would talk to you about the land. Now, the land could be terrible. It could be good. I don't care. We would describe that land now in the condition it would have to be 500 years from now for your descendants to live a life like that. Now we would describe that land not as a landscape, through ecological processes. How will the rainfall effectiveness have to be? How will the biodiversity need to function? High biodiversity, low biodiversity. How will the flow of energy, sunlight energy to all life, have to function on that land? These are simple things that you can learn very, very quickly. We do it in training. All right, so we would describe that as it would have to be, not a vision, as it would have to be far in the future. And then, because you are trading with people, you've got to sell something. You need people's support, advisors, consultants, the government officials you're working with. You can't change them. How are you going to have to be? You're judged at the end of the day not by your brand, not by all your promotional. You're judged by your behavior. How are you going to actually behave to have people wanting to work with you, wanting to help you, coming to your support? Now, that is a totally new concept. It's not in any branch of religion, science, or philosophy. That is what we discovered, thousands of us, in 1983. Now, with that in mind, we'd now look at your land. And we'd look at what you're proposing, anything you're proposing, and we'd open our minds to all science, indigenous knowledge. Open your mind now. And we'd say, we could do this, we could do that, we could do the other. And now we would just check, all right, that's the reason why you're taking this action. And every human action will be to meet a need, a desire, or to solve a problem. I guarantee 100% of your management actions will be for that reason. You don't want to change that, but you don't want it to have unintended consequences. So we would just simply say to any idea coming up, don't condemn it. So somebody could say, I think you should plant trees, or I think you should knock out a noxious plant, or whatever it is. If I say, no, that's a bad idea, I've built opposition. So say it's a good idea. So the person isn't knocked off guard. So it's a good idea. Now, if you agreed to this is what is wanted, let's check it against that. And when we checked it against that, if it passes and it's in line with what you want in your life and how the environment has to be, you'll do it. And if it's not in line, you won't. And the person who suggested it will say, oh, my suggestion was sincere, but it's not going to achieve what's needed. That is what we do.
Great answer. We're in the Loano Valley of Zambia. 1.2 million acres, Bopani woodland stretching from cathedral trees to Jess. It's a very pristine landscape with very few people, about 5,000 people in the whole valley. We've got areas beneath the trees that have very little grass, exposed soil in places. We have a major river, the Luansemfa, that runs through the middle of the whole thing, but still relatively low rainfall, even when they get it. Also a tsetse fly area, so we can't have domestic livestock there. And over the last 10 years, we've eliminated about 80% of the poaching, and the wildlife populations, including predators, have grown significantly. Given these conditions, what could be done to increase wildlife populations, improve species diversity, expand animals into areas where densities are currently low or non-existent, and improve grass cover and soil health?
I'm back to what I told you just now. You say you've eliminated poachers. You've used coercion. Yep. You've used force to do that. Yep. Right? Had you worked with the people and had the whole management been in the interests of the citizens, the population, and worked with them and not the institutions, found out how they want their lives to be, and I'm repeating myself of what I said to you just now, how do they want their lives to be? How will that environment have to be beyond describing species? All right, describing the health of the environment, because you described an environment that's deteriorating to me when you said bare ground under the trees, etc. All right, so we would just do that, and then see now how do we, as citizens, as people, with our chiefs, with our people, how do we bring this about? And if you take a thing like poaching, that would cease to be there.
Well, it was commercial bushmeat poaching. That was what was the biggest impact here.
All right, so and if it's commercial poaching,
yeah.
it is, commercial poachers can't operate without the support of citizens. It's like guerrilla warfare. Your guerrillas can't operate without the support of the citizens. Okay, so the commercial poachers get support. The citizens don't report their presence, don't report the camps. They could, immediately. So
but that's how we got rid of it, is that we were able to get the citizenry to a point where they actually had the benefits for their families and everything between the things that we've done locally.
Yeah,
with
but
infrastructure.
What if you'd increased the ability of those families to earn their own income living? You are paying them for money you're getting.
Well, I mean, we created a fish farm, so we're...
Correct.
Yeah.
So an authority, an institution is coming in, doing something, and paying some money to the citizens. When I used to work in Zambia, exactly 50 years after I left, Jody and I took my Unimog and we went up to try to revisit the parts of Zambia that I had worked in 50 years ago. And we went to Luangwa, up the Muchinga, Escarpment, Tupika, etc., etc. I had my diaries, what I had written when I'd done a foot tour through that area 50 years before. Each night as we camped, we read my diary, and we compared with what we were seeing today on the land and so on. It was really interesting. One of the overriding things with me, as I said to Jody at the end of it, I said, the biggest change to me is in the people. I said, 50 years ago, when I came through here, every headman, every crawl, everybody I passed, everywhere I was at, we greeted each other. We greeted each other. We exchanged gifts. If I camped near a headman's crawl, he would send me eggs or a chicken. If I had buffalo meat or elephant meat or whatever I had, I would send that to him. If I had some salt, I might send that to him. We would exchange gifts. People were dignified. I said, now, 50 years later, as we went through that whole area, I saw we had destroyed people's pride, destroyed their dignity. People were, we called it the Africa salute, begging. Everywhere we went, nobody greeted us. They begged. That is sad. That is through the sort of thing you're describing. NGOs coming in, institutions coming in, trying to manage it and provide an income. No.
So what's the alternative to what we're doing?
What I'm talking about. The laws, the regulations, Botswana, here, Zambia, they're all coming from government. They're all coming from institutions, going down. Now, when that governs what's happening, exactly where you're describing. All right, so all those laws, regulations, everything, the environment in which you're trying to help people. All right, so let's take it. The political party in power passes the laws. So you are president, leading that political party. You mean well. And so you want to discuss a problem, agriculture, whatever it is, wildlife, right? So you put together the experts. So you are going to be the judge. You are going to pass the laws, make the regulations. As a leader of an institution, what is your top interest? It's support for your party. What's your second interest? You've got to finance your party. If you can't finance your party, you're out. Your third interest is you've got to stay in power at all costs. So you've got three interests. Your fourth one is the interests of the citizens. Now, every expert, every person you bring in to advise you, I will guarantee is an expert employed by an institution. I'll guarantee it. What's the first interest of that institution? It has to finance itself. Second interest, it has to gain support, etc. At best, its third interest is the citizens. So you've got everybody at the table developing the policy for that area in which you're going to operate, in which at best the third interest is the interests of the citizens. That is why universally we are seeing policies develop that have unintended consequences. That's what I'm talking about. If we want to put that right, let's develop policy in the interests of the citizens.
If I'm going to try to change the policies in Zambia where I'm working, where I have this concession, do I need to talk to the government and talk with the chiefs and try to figure out a better way to do all this?
No. Just speak to the government, to the president, and just say, there's a guy called Savory. He gave a talk at COP26, 12-minute talk. He describes this. Why don't you talk to him? Because I described how to do this, what we essentially need to do. All he needs to do is talk to me.
Sure. So
and we could explain, how you do this.
So if he just watches COP26 in 12 minutes, he'll have an idea of what you're talking about.
Well, yes, they do. Everybody I talk to directly gets it. When I talk to you and you talk to somebody else, when I give the message, send reinforcements, we're going to advance, by the time it goes through one person, it becomes send refreshments, we're going to advance. So they just need to talk directly. Now, we had an example in this country. We had an example. It's published in my textbook, third edition. In this country, because of my past military, political, etc. connections, the government asked me about 10 years ago if I would run a short workshop for 35 members of parliament. Now, these are the lawmakers. Now, when I left here to go and do it, our staff appealed to me, please, Allan, don't touch agriculture, wildlife, land, it's too volatile. We were in a country of great conflict. I said, never mind what I'm going to do. When I got there, I met with 35 lawmakers from two opposing political parties. There was an atmosphere in the room, there was hostility, they sat at opposite sides, and so what I did with them was just say, you are lawmakers, you create the policies in this country, how do you do it? They never thought of that. I got them to discuss how they develop policy, and they pretty well described what I was talking about. And I said, there is another way of doing it, and we could do it in the interests of our citizens. And I said, for your interest, I've written out a generic, holistic context of how I'm one of our citizens. I've lived here all my life, except for 4 years. And I said, I've written down what I think most of us, no matter what color, no matter what tribe, most of us want, and what the environment would have to be like hundreds of years from now, etc. And I said, I don't have the time in a one-day workshop to develop a real one with citizens. So I've written this, and your citizens, change anything you want to. They asked me to change one word. They said, Allan, that's what everybody wants. I said, fine. And the whole atmosphere changed. I suddenly wasn't dealing with 35 members of parliament in two parties actually killing each other at the time. Suddenly I was dealing with 35 Zimbabweans. Whole atmosphere changed. By the end of the day, we had an agricultural wildlife policy the world would dream of. It took us one day. And the reactions I got for that were two. All of them said, oh my God, we've had World Bank, economists, endless consultants advising government on policy development. Nobody has ever shown us how easy it is to do. That was their main comment. Their second comment was, we need to do this at cabinet level, which is correct. That's 10 years ago. I'm still waiting. They didn't do it.
So even though you gave them the solutions, they never enacted.
Exactly. Just like I gave a way to solve these problems at COP26. The only thing I've ever put out that has never had a word of criticism, not one, all these years later, but nobody has acted. Yeah, the difficulty is people don't act. So there's a way around that, and we talked about it just now. Just get one statesman, leader, to act as a statesman. Just talk to me. Because there's a way to do this with no political risk. Get everybody to observe how easy it is and just see what happens. And if people like it, adopt it. It'll start a domino effect. If I'm wrong, fine. Scrap it. But at least try when the situation is so desperate now globally.
Okay, we're going to move into a different subject matter. Hunting, something you love to do, or you've done all your life. Why did you hunt?
Why did I hunt? I think it's in our blood as males. And I just, from a little boy, started when I was mixing with the kids on my uncle's ranch, all the herdsmen and the other kids, were mixing. I was the one white guy, but we all mixed, played every day. And a lot of our time was riding donkeys or hunting and fishing. Yeah, just in our blood, I think.
So why should humans hunt? If you could paraphrase the question for me.
Well, agriculture, without that you cannot have a city, you cannot have any business, you couldn't be interviewing me today, you cannot have a government, you cannot have a church, you cannot have anything. And agriculture is the production of food and natural fiber from the world's land and waters, the oceans, the lakes, everything. Now, a major chunk of that is wildlife, fish in the oceans. For centuries, it's been harvesting wildlife that has kept people going. It still is, right? So that's part of agriculture. And so when you talk about hunting, think of it like harvesting, right? People have been harvesting or hunting for centuries, and we have a lot of wildlife. Now, when we forced poaching onto people through our laws and regulations and conservation and all the environmental organizations, what happened? If you prevent me as a person trying to sustain my family here from hunting, and a major part of the meat is going to come from wildlife, you're going to force me to be a poacher. You're going to force me to. I didn't want to be a poacher, but I've got to sustain my family. Now, there's a very big difference. If you're hunting or harvesting well, based on what we know scientifically, you increase animal populations. We harvest cattle, sheep, goats. They increase, not decrease. We kill millions, but they increase, right? Think of that like hunting. Now, if you force me to poaching, the population decreases. Now, the difference between these two is very easy to understand. If you're a rancher and effectively harvesting your cattle, or if you're wildlife managing and you're effectively harvesting, you tend to harvest the animals you can. So that is, you'll be harvesting the older animals, etc., etc. Now, if you force me to poach, what will I be killing? I'll be killing mostly females and young. So just think of yourself as a rancher. If you as a rancher kill mostly your breeding cows and mostly your calves, your population of cattle is going to decrease, I promise you. If you as a rancher kill mostly cull bulls, cull cows, and males, your population is going to increase. There's no difference. Why do we understand it as ranchers and totally fail to understand it as politicians, citizens, hunters who, in safari companies and so on, are getting hunting a bad name? The world needs far more hunting and far more wildlife.
Explain that to me. How is hunting important to wildlife in these landscapes?
Well, I've just explained that by hunting, you increase the population. Now, if you don't do either, all right, as we don't when we rewild here in our national parks, you see the example. We're losing biodiversity, etc. Why? Because with habitat destruction, you start to lose the young and the females. So in the research I describe in the book, working on one of the big forest areas here, we had sable and eland we were dealing with. Dr. Mosman, myself, and others that were trying to show that by hunting and giving up value, we could increase the population, and we were. Because when we started and sampled the population, we found that about 80% of the females were not surviving to breeding age. When we started hunting strongly and randomly and shooting random adults, etc., that picture began to change dramatically. And within a very short time, we had a great increase in the young females surviving to breeding age. That tells us that population is now going to go up. But at that point, as I describe in the memoir, experts in national parks cancelled the permits and forced us into bankruptcy.
So should we be hunting our rewilded national parks in order to increase?
No, you should be at the state level, at the country level, managing the resources. What is the role of national parks? We're not even asking that. What is the role of national parks? The place of biodiversity is everywhere, not in some protected areas. You today looked at a 1-minute video, 15 seconds over 2 national parks, 15 seconds over community here, 15 seconds over this land. In the first 45 seconds, you saw probably 90% bare ground. This is same-day stuff. Over this ground, you saw almost no bare ground. Here, biodiversity, everything's beginning to thrive. Thousands of trees are growing here, and we haven't planted one. We've just changed the management. And that's what we need to do. And when we do that, our national parks will start to be what they're supposed to be, centers of biodiversity abundance, not loss.
But in this modern age, should humans still hunt?
Absolutely.
But why?
Because you want to maintain healthy populations. If you let a population, all right, community is the level at which natures function. If one population gets excessively high, all right, it will begin to be regulated naturally by disease, accidents, etc. You don't want disease, etc. If you can, with modern knowledge, etc., and not exclude humans, because we're part of it. The moment you exclude us, it's not natural. Now, if you can do that, you can regulate that and keep the population healthy and not get to that starvation and disease level. And I describe that in the memoir. how in the Thule Circle area of this country, I had to watch 50,000 head of game die of starvation, disease, cruel death. Nature is not humane, that's a human concept. If you leave things to die in nature alone, how do they die? Everything in nature dies at the end of the day from starvation, accident, disease, or predation. These are horrible deaths. There is no alternative for 99% of all life. Now, the kindest of those is predation. If I was here just having to live my life out naturally, etc., I would pray to be killed by a lion, because that's more humane than dying from disease, accident, etc. But there isn't an understanding of that. So we've got good people trying to be kind to animals that are causing enormous suffering, as happened here. 50,000 animals died because good people said I was a murderer and a slaughterer because I wanted us to intervene with humane deaths.
So I want to change a little bit here, and I know that you've talked about this, but I kind of want to try to encapsulate something here. Over the course of your life, you've combined many, many different influences from experiences you've had. You know, your bush skills as a game officer, the tracking during the war, reading the landscapes through disturbance and use, developing these holistic management tools, working on ranches across North and South America, and understanding the role of humidity and brittle environments. If somebody said, hey, could you just lay out a simple plan for managing land, what would it be? Now, I know you're going to say you got to start the people, but I mean, just if you were going to give me just here's where you need to start, what would you say?
I would say start with the people. You cannot manage land. Land is so tied to the culture and the people and the economy and the people. So if you say you want to manage land, I will tell you right now you cannot do that. We have tried to do that for centuries. And it's led to 2/3 of the world's desertification. It's led to agriculture on which every business in the world is dependent, being our most destructive industry ever. So stop trying to manage landscapes and land.
So we have this highly urbanized population of humans now, all over the world, especially in the Western world. What do people in the urban world need to understand about these landscapes and managing them? When it comes to soils, plants, animals, because you said ultimately it supports their lives, right? Because they live in cities. Why does understanding this matter? Why do these urban people need to understand this, and how is the best way to make them understand it?
I said earlier that at the institutional level, everything is run ultimately by political parties passing laws. What you're describing is that the political power has moved to the cities. Yes, that is so. So therefore, what the people in the cities need to understand is how to develop policies to sustain their city. Now, recently, I was on a podcast with a Hungarian woman and 2 Australians who are experts in sustainable cities, etc. And that's an interesting one to look at because they're good people, and we had a very good discussion on that podcast, and their view of sustainable cities was essentially how do you build more modern housing, how do you do this, that and the other in the city. And I had to point out, no city is going to be sustainable until agriculture is. That's what the people in the cities need to understand, is that food doesn't come off a shelf. It comes off land. And so you've got it supported by people of the cities at the moment, what I described in COP26, when I said you will have it's the same at every international conference virtually, you will have a small proportion of people here to sustain the cities, if you like, promoting farmers, ranchers, pastoralists producing food based on the biological sciences, which is mostly means ecology. And then you have a vast majority, okay, that will be promoting, to sustain our cities with agriculture, they will be promoting corporate production of food based on chemistry and technology. I can tell you that is going to fail. You cannot solve ecological, biological problems with chemistry and technology. That is why agriculture today is the most destructive industry ever. So city people need to understand that because they control that.
Great. Okay, we're getting to the end here. Future. You're 90. When you began your career as a game officer in the 50s, the human population and impact on the planet was dramatically smaller. Looking ahead, what do you think will happen over the next 50 to 100 years? And what concerns you the most? What gives you hope?
When asked that question, and I do it a lot, I'm at the tail end of my life. I'm in my 91st year, so I've got 1 or 2 years left. And I'm more concerned about the future now than I ever was in my life. Right? So I think there's great hope if we address the root cause of what we've been talking about. If we don't address the root cause, which is the way in which policies are developed, it's nothing else. If we don't address that, then the future is grim. Because I can tell you with certainty that we've seen more than 20 civilizations fail, and you're globally seeing civilization threatened now. And when city-based civilization, which it is, when our cities fail, as they will if we cannot feed them without destroying our environment, the suffering will be beyond anything we've ever experienced. The conflict, the deaths, the wars, the suffering. So I see great hope because in 1983 we discovered that there wasn't a solution to that, but there was a way for all of us to work together to solve it together. And if I can convey that in the end of my life and how to facilitate that I would die happy.
So we're recording this for posterity. If you had a message for people 100 years from now, 500 years from now, what would that message be?
I would hate it to be the same one as it was in my memoir in Zimbabwe. When I came back to my country after 4 years of exile and just had a meal in the capital, people across the restaurant, when they recognized me, would come up and talk to me. And essentially the message of every one of them was, oh my God, we should have listened. So in answer to your question, if I could come back 100 years ago, I would love to not be able to say, I wish you'd listened.
Okay, last question. If you were to look back over the course of your life, what has been your greatest accomplishment?
I will die happy because I've spent my life trying to find a way to solve what I see as the biggest problem facing humanity. And I would die happy having, in 1983, albeit in its infancy, found a way in which we could do that. It would be sad for me if it is like so many things in history to die because of the opposition to thinking that is new, as has happened to every single human who discovered something new, truly new. That would be sad for me because we are running out of time, although you can never say it's too late. But you said it earlier, that in my young days the population, the impact was a certain amount. It's escalating. The biodiversity on which everything depends in a biosphere is generally acknowledged to be in free fall. That should be a big, big red flag in every business in the world. It's hardly even talked about. We are totally dependent on biodiversity.
Anything you want to add?
Well, if you asked people at the conference yesterday, if you had asked them what is biodiversity, they'd have started naming certain animals, lions, elephants, giraffe. That's not biodiversity. Biodiversity is what's in your gut, in your blood, and you. As I look at you, you are more microorganisms than human cells, but you're functioning as a human. Biodiversity out here is the diversity of life under the soil, where there's more life than there is above. We never talked about that yesterday, you see. Biodiversity to most people means charismatic species. No, it doesn't.
Is that it?
Unless you've got something else. One thing, if there's something, when you say, is that it, I would just make an appeal. You've recorded, you've questioned me, I asked you to be hostile and to question me as hard as you could. You were going to show this to many people. I would appeal to every single one of those humans that you show this to, if they feel something I said was wrong, logically or scientifically, to let me know. Because I've been making that appeal for over 50 years. And mostly I just get character assassination.
Excellent. Excellent interview.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.